When it comes to modernizing identity, Active Directory just makes everything harder, from managing access for contractors and departing employees to securing cloud apps and on-prem systems. Your company deserves better. Choose Okta, the modern identity platform that securely connects anyone that touches your organization to any technology they want to use. Okta reduces AD vulnerabilities, secures not only employees but contractors and customers, simplifies domain consolidation, and reduces your attack surface. To learn more, visit securityweekly.com/Okta. Security can't solve crucial problems when they have to wade through thousands of alerts a day. With ServiceNow, you can easily prioritize and respond to your most crucial business threats. That way you can go from overwhelmed to under control. ServiceNow brings security, risk, and IT together on one platform. Learn more at securityweekly.com/ServiceNow. Welcome back, everyone, to Enterprise Security Weekly. As we said at the top of the show, we'd like to welcome our sponsor, Great Horn, who is disrupting the email security industry to better protect organizations against phishing and other advanced email threats through modern data analytics, machine learning, and cloud-native design. Run by a team of cybersecurity veterans with a track record of success, Great Horn combines patented threat detection, continuous monitoring, end-user education, and integrated remediation capabilities into one comprehensive platform. Visit securityweekly.com/Greathorn to learn more and schedule a demo today. And one more quick announcement. We need your help in a survey that we're running for research purposes. How mature is your process automation for your various security capabilities? Visit securityweekly.com, 5 stages of automation maturity. Whew, it's a mouthful. To submit your response to the 5 stages of automation maturity survey. We will share the results in a webcast in November. Matt Wyckhouse is here with us. He has more than 15 years of experience developing advanced software to support offensive and defensive cyber operations, which led Matt Wyckhouse to co-found Finite State in 2017. Matt, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. I'm a big fan.
Oh, yes. It's nice to have you here. Thank you very much.
Andy's a Buckeye.
Yes,
so we already did our OH.
That's right.
We can do it again.
Yeah.
IO.
Yeah. OH. Yeah. Anyways.
So we're here talking about IoT, which we're talking a little bit at the off air about IoT security as also it's specific to supply chain security in the era of IoT. So, Matt, why don't you tell us a little bit about your kind of research and also background in IoT security?
Yeah, so like you said in the introduction, I spent most of my career supporting the U.S. intelligence community and the Department of Defense in both, offensive and defensive cyber operations across a number of agencies, and really where my team's sweet spot was in finding vulnerabilities in what we used to just call embedded systems,
right? Yep.
Yeah, and eventually that all became lumped into this IoT category that's been a giant challenge for security teams. And so we spent a lot of time, over our history, finding vulnerabilities in systems and enabling operations targeting those systems. And what we found that I think is probably pretty obvious to everyone here is that security was getting far better on things like mobile devices and PCs because the operating systems were getting better. As more and more IoT devices started coming out, none of those protections that were built into other platforms were found there. So we kind of regressed, went back about a decade, and then more and more got built on top of really legacy code bases that were full of vulnerabilities. So something, in order to conduct an operation, there might have been a time where it would take us months or a year to find an access. If we were dealing with an IoT device, we could do it in a day. And when you really zoom out and look at that problem, there are so many embedded devices on networks right now across pretty much every vertical that as an attacker, you have all of these new entry points, you have all of these new pivot points, and we have a security industry that's been securing the other half of that network, and attackers are migrating and changing their tactics to go after the easier targets. And that's why we started Finite State.
And you did some really interesting research. One of the reasons we wanted to bring you on, we kind of set this up on Business Security Weekly on Monday around Huawei, right? There's been a lot of news around Huawei and 5G, and you guys actually went out and analyzed a bunch of the Huawei devices and created this really great research report, by the way.
I think I just read that article.
Did you? Oh, good. That means your news feed's working.
Yeah.
So give us a background on why the Huawei research, and then I'd love to dig into some of the findings, because I think there's some really interesting findings here that people just need to be aware of when we go down this path of 5G and what this means with Huawei gear in the mix.
Yeah, it's been a really interesting time since we published this report. But take a step back. One of the things that we view as a problem in IoT is supply chain security, and that can be IoT as in a smart camera or any embedded device where you as a security team or you as an IT team don't have the ability to provision that device, analyze the software that's in it, and decide if you want to accept the risk associated with that. With IoT, with embedded devices, you have all of this risk that's locked up in the supply chain of that device, and you have no visibility into it. So we basically built out this really, really unprecedented level of scale in a firmware analysis system that allows us to take firmware images, pick them apart, and conduct really detailed static and dynamic analysis on them to understand the security properties. And what we did earlier this year was, on behalf of a customer who was looking at Huawei devices, we took a lot of Huawei firmware. We actually took almost 10,000 firmware images that covered about 550 different products in their networking product line, and pushed it through that system, collected the analysis and combed through that data. And we wound up taking the rather, I'll say unusual step of making that public because of the findings that we had.
You want that system, don't you?
Well, I started scripting some portions of that system, and it's a huge pain in the ass. What's the processor architecture that's largely in common with all those devices, Matt?
So we find everything in networking equipment. It's a lot of MIPS.
Yeah.
Sometimes we see PowerPC, ARM in a lot of the newer devices.
But MIPS in and of itself, there's like a dozen or more different versions of the MIPS architecture, right?
Exactly. Yeah, that's the challenge with security audits on a lot of these devices is you find these peculiar ISAs, or you find really strange libraries, you find these hardware dependencies, and doing that in a scalable way is just a very difficult problem.
Yeah, and the byte order is always different.
Exactly.
It's a huge pain in the ass when you're trying to reverse engineer it. Sometimes the byte order is one way or the other. And analyzing just emulating that firmware is extremely difficult, which is why I only think there's only a handful of companies that really have this technology. Like I can probably think of maybe 2 or 3 other organizations that have and are doing this particular type of testing, because it's extremely complex and there's just so many variables.
Yeah, that's exactly right. We had we started about 2 years ago. The interesting thing that happened during that time was Ghidra was finally made public, and so we were able to shift our underlying static analysis to Ghidra, which has a lot of nice processor support. Before that, we were using a combination of IDA and Binary Ninja, which are both great tools, but having Ghidra allows us to really stay ahead of the instruction set problem.
Yeah, that's really cool.
Yeah, I figured you'd love this segment because you've done a lot of research in this space.
Yeah, I did. And it's interesting, we Matt and I both have the history where we called them embedded devices or embedded systems, and then we came with this IoT term. And what's interesting, it sounds like you're doing that, like the more traditional firmware analysis piece of it. When we step out into IoT, what I really like that term to mean is it's no longer just a device that's sitting on the network that's communicating over protocols. When you flip to IoT, now you're introducing APIs that talk to the cloud and cloud services, right? Those cloud services have user interfaces that could yet be separate from APIs in the cloud, which are yet separate from APIs that might be available on the device. And then you've got the mobile app component as well, which is also likely using the same or maybe similar or different APIs. in the system. So that introduces so much more complexity, which is where I like to put IoT devices versus embedded systems. Do you agree, Matt?
Yeah, I do. We use IoT pretty broadly because, to us, it's more of a functional definition when you look at it through the security lens. It's a device that's on your network. It's going to talk to some set of services, and your IT team or your security team does not have the ability to provision that. And realistically, you don't have the ability to inspect it very well. And so when we look at IoT, one of the things we tell our customers, and as we're talking to folks, is it's probably the single largest source of unmanaged third-party risk that anyone has right now, because most organizations don't even know what devices are there, let alone what services they're talking to. And that's the big problem.
I think if I were to kind of pinpoint the set of problems, I mean, it's really, you can almost use the term AAA, right? It's authentication, authorization, and access, right? And if you start with access, one thing you realize when you step into this realm is that if you're on the same network as the device, you can access stuff on it without the other two A's, right? And that's just one problem, right? And when we get into authentication and authorization, I mean, typically authorization really isn't, there's no role separation typically in these devices. In authentication, we talk about all of these different issues. There can be backdoors built into it. There can be default passwords. There can be weak credentials. There could be no authentication to access some of the services, or weak authentication, such as or like a reproducible one where the same SSH key is used, private key is used on all the devices that are sold to, and that's a huge supply chain issue that I really think is just poor sysadmin and poor architecture, right?
You're exactly right. So the challenge with IoT compared to your other assets is that you don't get to be the sysadmin. You're depending on the OEM to be the sysadmin and put provision the right accounts, put the correct permissions in place, lock that device down in a way, or provide you the interface to be able to control those things in a way that you can actually administer it. But most of the time, we find that there are hard-coded credentials in there. There are outdated software components that are allowing for trivial, fully remote privileged access to these devices. There's all sorts of things that are in there that the reason they continue to be in there is no one is able to verify the security properties of these. And until we get to a level of transparency where if you're buying one of these devices, you can verify it and communicate with the seller, the OEM, and say, look, you've got to fix these problems before I put it on my network. That's the future we want to build. I think that we can get there pretty quickly. We're demonstrating that you can, at scale, analyze these things and start to provide that oversight. But until we get there, we're going to continue having these sorts of problems. And, back to Huawei, the reason that we looked at that is because the consequences of having backdoors in that infrastructure are pretty serious.
Yeah, no, completely agree. And even if you overcome some of those AAA issues, as we've outlined, you still have some of the more major categories, such as the management interfaces or user interfaces to them are web-based and largely contain all kinds of vulnerabilities in web applications, right? Then you've also got, I think, is another huge issue, independent of all of that, are the protocols that these devices are implementing, many of which can be broadcast, multicast, using all kinds of different types of protocols that you could have the most hardened authentication to the system you want, but it's implemented a protocol that is like SNMP was back in the day, right? The original SNMP. You could set a new password on your router. You could install SSH and do all those things. But if you left SNMP wide open, you might as well just give someone the password. And that's another huge issue is the protocols they use and how they are not configuring them for security. Or the protocol just has no security built in whatsoever, similar in critical controls.
You're spot on there. You wouldn't believe how often we find Telnet open and running on networks, and almost every single time it's because it's some IoT device that has that on by default, and it's really hard to find that in the settings and go turn it off, and sometimes you can't.
Right.
And that's the challenge for a security team. The complexity that all of these IoT devices introduce, whether it's trying to patch these things or lock them down. It's just too much for anyone to realistically handle right now. And most security teams are still living in a world where they don't even know what devices they have. And that's, we've really put a lot of effort into helping organizations understand what you have, how to manage those devices, how to detect when those things are being attacked, and really proactively how to understand what the risk is in these things.
Yeah. So back to the Huawei report. Let's go through some of the findings, because I think you've nailed a couple of them already.
Oh, I have more.
Yeah, I'm sure you do. I'm curious, what did you find, Matt, when you went through and analyzed almost 10,000 firmware samples?
Yeah, so we the really cool thing is the system was able to do all of that work in about 36 total hours of computation.
Awesome. Wow.
And at the end of that, we kind of went into it expecting to find a handful of things, but the findings were far more severe than we expected. So we found that, in 55% of the devices we looked at, there was at least one category of access vulnerability we would consider a backdoor. That's going to be a hard-coded credential. That's going to be a hard-coded crypto key. That's going to be, in an extreme sense, an authorized key file or authorized keys file that's going to allow for, the corresponding key to just access that whenever. We found more than half the devices had something that was trivial to find. Literally, you unpack the firmware, you look for these things, they're sitting right there. Some of the accounts had were named Huawei, and they had a password of Huawei in leet speak. They were very obvious problems that we found. We went deeper than that as well and found a lot of other issues that you could attribute to really poor product security engineering. We found that on average, the third-party components in the most recent version of firmware for these devices, on average, they were 5.5 years old. So they weren't keeping their third-party or open source components updated, which led to tons of vulnerabilities.
You're hitting on all the areas, right? Yeah. Including stuff that we know is vulnerable. But I imagine that in your analysis software, you can also spot any custom code that they wrote and, pick up on things like stir copy that's not validated and find potential buffer overflows too, right?
Exactly. We also, we take every binary that we find and we run it through a really detailed, static and semi-dynamic analysis. We found buffer overflows galore. We found utilization of really functions that should be blacklisted when you're building secure devices. We found times where there were really nasty functions like stir copy that you have a safe variant of that, stir copy _ S. And the Huawei engineers apparently created a different implementation of stir copy S that looked like it was secure because of the name, but actually it was just directly calling stir copy. They were ignoring any of the other parameters that were going in.
That's so they can that's so they can pass their code audits. Hey, we're using stir copy S, but it's really their own built-in function, right? That doesn't implement it correctly.
That's exactly right. I mean, when you have it really comes down to the incentives and the culture that you put in place if you want to build really secure products, and clearly they have some work to do.
I'd say one area we haven't touched on yet is validation of firmware updates and validating the firmware. Largely, from what you've described so far, I would venture to guess that didn't exist.
The validation of the firmware updates? No, there was very limited. I think there were times where there were checksums in there. Most of the time, the firmware was able to be updated over an unencrypted protocol without much in the way of verification. The firmware images weren't encrypted, or I believe in most cases they also weren't necessarily signed or verified for signatures.
And to me, in everything we've talked about, and especially in this context with Huawei, that's the most dangerous scenario to be in, and I've always speculated this since I first, wrote the book on Linksys routers in 2007. And when I was learning about all this stuff, I was like, you could be really, really stealthy, you just build your own firmware, or you don't even need to, right? If you can get the firmware, take it apart, slip your binary in there, put it all back together, if they're not checking the validity of that firmware, that means that firmware is valid and runs on that device as a firmware update. And now I'm inside the system. And since there's no keyboard, mouse, monitor on any of these systems, you're relying on the teams to spot anomalous behavior on the network, right? And granted, we all need to do that, but it's too late. I'm already inside your device. All of the other functionality I can make look exactly the same, except I've got a foothold on that device. Better yet, if I build it into the BIOS or inside, so that it just repopulates every time, right?
Right. I mean, you're spot on again, and it's that we've seen that actually. I mean, Asus had an incident earlier this year where their firmware update server was compromised and malicious backdoors were added into it. We've seen even Huawei had issues with their PC firmware and having too much privilege on those PCs. We're seeing, things that might not be intentional backdoors, but for example, today the Huawei Mate 30 Pro had some issues because they had effectively a backdoor built in that would allow people to sideload Google Apps on it, but it also had this really interesting property of having incredibly high privileges on the system that could allow for other nefarious things to happen.
That was the article that I read on Medium, actually. Is that the one you're referring to?
Yeah. Yep, exactly. So malicious firmware updates are a real thing, and it really depends on your threat model too. And that's why the 5G security issue has become such a national security issue. Is the threat model is different. If you're worried about the OEM of the product being part of the threat or a vector into your network, or a possible cooperation with a foreign intelligence service, the things that you're looking for are a little bit different. Even having signed firmware updates, if the OEM is your adversary, it doesn't really help you.
Right. Knowing that they have backdoors in the first place, you don't necessarily need somebody to insert a backdoor through unsigned firmware. It's already there, which is why I guess backdoors is number 1 in the findings, and the firmware verification process is number 5, because there's enough already existing backdoors in the Huawei gear that you don't even have to leverage number 5.
Right.
Yeah. So the easiest way to have backdoors in a system, if you really want to be nefarious about it, would be to have plenty of vulnerabilities in that system and have your customers accept that that's okay, so that anyone that wanted to get into those systems would do it the normal way by exploiting a vulnerability or exploiting a default credential, things like that. I'm not suggesting that they did that intentionally, but it makes it far easier for any intelligence service, whether it's the Chinese or the Russian or any other government or criminal organization, to get into those devices, and it's hard to attribute those attacks at that point. But the bottom line is it makes everyone less safe, and we want that to be remedied.
So, Matt, obviously this report's out there. Anybody can go to Finite State's website and get it. I downloaded it to prepare for the interview. What's been some of the responses now that you've published this? Are you getting interest from our intel services and other folks to say, great research, this is kind of what we were thinking before? Is it changing the narrative now around this whole discussion with Huawei and 5G, and kind of what are you seeing now as a result of the research?
Huawei's completely done a 180 on security, right?
So I'll answer those in order. The first is we are getting a lot of interest from governments around the world, including the U.S. government, and most governments are just appreciative that there's data now to make their decisions rather than just speculation. Before we did this, you had, let's say the US government just making accusations that Huawei obviously has backdoors in their devices, and Huawei in China saying, of course not, we would never do something like that. And the reality is it's not a simple yes or no answer. It's more complex and nuanced, and we can provide that data in a report that's pretty easy for policymakers to consume. And so we have had a lot of outreach from governments. The U.S. government has been very interested in our research and has also been using it as they're talking to other countries around the world about 5G security. Our goal is to do exactly what you just said and have Huawei improve their security. In fact, we want everyone that's building critical technology to improve their security. And the only way that it's going to happen is if we force some transparency into relationships that have never had that before. And that's why we put these reports out there.
Have you been working with the Huawei team? Are they interested in engaging or not? I'm just curious.
We've had, let's say, a fragmented response from Huawei. The first response we got was from their U.S. Chief Security Officer, Andy Purdy, who said, hey, we're still looking at this report, but this is exactly the type of research that needs to be done across the board, whether that's Huawei technology or anyone else's. Mm-hmm. And that sort of verification needs to happen in order to make everyone more secure, which was exactly the right response. Their product security team actually wrote up a counter narrative to our report that was a little bit inflammatory and very misguided, and dismissed a lot of the security issues that we found as not being very important, while on the other side of their mouth, they were saying, well, we're also going to fix those things. So
that was so politically correct, Matt. That was amazing. Just do me one favor. If Huawei invites you over to China, please don't go, because I like you. And I don't want to see anything happen to you.
I kind of realized when we put this out that travel to China might be out of the crossed off the list.
Yeah.
Probably a good idea.
But speaking of remediation, these are all very fixable problems. And several frameworks have emerged to provide IoT device manufacturers a framework and an architecture to provide trusted computing platform, to provide secure management. And there are, of course, secure protocols, secure ways of managing things. We talk about code processes all the time and how to get rid of security bugs in your code and have a secure development process. So all of these things are fixable. It's frustrating because over the past 20 years, I've seen very little movement. I mean, here and there, vendors they get it. I always like to talk about Ring as being really good and proactive in fixing security things and going, you know what, we're just going to push firmware out to all our devices and fix that issue. I'm like, that's awesome. That I can recommend that product and that strategy to other companies as well. It's just frustrating that we don't see more adoption of the right way to do this, so we don't have all these vulnerabilities in all this firmware that Matt found.
Yeah, I mean, exactly. And part of the reason, again, that we took this rather unprecedented step to release this report was that, that what you just said is true, but Huawei also, in particular, has been working with the UK government for 9 years, where they have full source code auditing and full vulnerability reporting back to Huawei, and it has not had any meaningful impact on their security posture in that time. You can read every report that program through the UK NCSC. You can read every report that they've put out, and they continue to find the same problems. And the product security approach that they have has just been really poor. And until there's more public information, more pressure from their customers on them to build better products, they're not going to change it.
Yep.
I'm just curious. Any other research in the works? I'm curious what else you're analyzing, because I think this data is very interesting to get out and help educate others on where some of these security vulnerabilities exist.
We always have a lot in the works. We've been doing a lot of work in healthcare lately, and so we've been looking at medical devices. We've analyzed about 300,000 different firmware images to date, and the platform we have allows our customers to just upload new ones, and you get answers in a couple minutes. And we're starting actually to work with OEMs as well to help them more proactively manage their risks. So we're continuing to add more and more and more firmware into our system, which gives us these really cool data network effects that allow us to find similarities and find a vulnerability in one device and check it out across all of these other ones. And we can very quickly generate new reports that look a lot like what you see in that Huawei report.
That's great. I mean, that's value, right? If I'm an OEM and I want somebody independent to go test this stuff, I mean, I think that's a great value back to the OEMs to do a better job of securing their products and securing the overall supply chain.
Well, and I think if they added into their DevOps process that every time they build a new firmware image, it goes off and gets checked, right? I mean, that's the kind of stuff we talk about all the time. Why isn't that happening now and across all of these manufacturers?
Right. Exactly.
I don't get it.
Yeah, and some manufacturers are investing in security within the DevOps process. The problem is that most DevOps security tools are really designed for, finding bugs inside of software that eventually becomes one binary of many that's linked into a firmware image. There's not much out there that's looking at the firmware image as a whole and saying, hey, you still have default credentials built in here, or you left telnet configured to be on by default, or when you put these, you're using third-party libraries that have quite a few CVEs in them and they're just sitting there in the file system. That's, I think that the existing DevOps processes don't necessarily do that very well for embedded devices. And so there's a way that we can help with that. And I would expect to see more and more vendors pushing and supporting the IoT manufacturers in that endeavor as well.
Yeah.
That's cool.
That is good. That was a great report, by the way. It's just chock full of data for anybody who wants to dig in and understand, what the firmware research found. It's a great job, Matt, to you and the team for pulling all that together.
And folks can find this report on your website, finitestate.io.
That's right. Yep. And we're happy to answer any additional questions. Really appreciate the kind words about the report. The team did a lot of work to make that happen. And the results were really very interesting and impactful.
Awesome.
Thank you so much, Matt.
Thank you very much. I appreciate you having me on.
Excellent. With that, that'll conclude the show. Thank you, everyone, for listening and watching Enterprise Security Weekly. We'll see you next time.